Welcome to the Optimalist podcast, where we examine just what it takes to ensure humans flourish in the age of AI. I'm Sarah, your host through this exploration of mindfulness, attention, focus, happiness, and motivation, all elements of human flourishing. So how do we cultivate them? This week, I welcome Tim Belmont to the show. Tim is a special guest because he's a longstanding member of our community, and he's also the editor of this very podcast. Tim is a high school English teacher and technology specialist based in New Jersey. Over the past 10 years, he's explored how technology can enhance instruction through projects such as student podcasting, and has shared his experiences at various conferences. His own personal interest in mindfulness and meditation continues to affect his teaching practice, encouraging students to be present. Listen as Tim and I discuss his own journey through mindfulness and how he applies that experience to his teaching, and why it's so important right now for us to help students find sustainable ways to have better attention in all areas of their lives. All this and more in my conversation with Tim. Have a listen.
Over the last 10 years, my role has changed a bit. For example, around 4 years ago, aside from being an English teacher, I'm also my school's educational technology specialist. And over the last 10 years of my teaching, I've sort of had these interests that have popped up here and there that basically come from my personal life that I try and infuse into my teaching and my technology specialist work. And really, some of those things have been coding, so computer science, because it's something that I've done just in my free time. I enjoy doing. I've developed websites, and then mindfulness as well, which is something that has been really huge in just helping me get to where I am today through meditation. And that's something that sort of came to me more when I was in college. And as far as where my journey is at right now, really, I'm at a phase where I'm exploring just things that I find interesting, which one thing about myself, which I'd like to think is a strength, but could sort of be a detriment, is I have a lot of interest in a lot of different things. So I explore things on the surface level a lot, but then I also try and dive in. So lately it's been a lot of interest in things like AI, still in coding as well, and then things like media literacy. So I'm just sort of doing my thing as a teacher and tech specialist, and then exploring things that are intriguing to me as well.
I'm sure that a lot of not only the things that you're mentioning that you're interested in, but also this attitude and approach towards learning and curiosity and following things that may spark your interest or may lead to you finding something else you're interested in just because you are putting attention and time into it. I'm sure all of that attitude also is visible and noticeable to your students and kind of rubs off on your classroom environment. Would you say that that's true?
I mean, I hope so. I hope to try and inspire just curiosity, which I know has been addressed on this podcast before. And just when something sparks some interest, just taking some time to take a look at it and take it in. And it's interesting because there's sort of this balance between sitting down and having a steady focus on one thing, and then still being open to other opportunities and areas of interest that show up. But I try, and also in my English class, I try and enforce it's not just all about sitting down and opening a book and reading it. It's about exploring other ideas and other mediums as well.
I was doing or co-hosting a webinar last week, and we were talking about self-regulation practices that you can teach or set students up to work on, I guess, now to get them able to do it on their own over the summer. So what can you do now to kind of give kids tools to almost manage not just their time and the way they spend their summer, but the way they think about who has control over their time. They have more control over it than they think, as we all do, and their attention. And one of the things that we were talking about was this idea that we get so I think, hung up on how can we, like, what are you interested in? Like, what should you do over the summer? What should you, what extracurricular activities should you or any particular person participate in? Like, if you're interested in it, follow it. But we were saying on this webinar that, and this is something we believe deeply at Focusable as well, what if you turned to the person sitting next to you and looked at what they're interested in and kind of learned a little bit about that and and the person across the room and the person across the hall? Like, what if we spend our attention a little bit on things that don't initially drive us to see what opportunities are available outside of our own, like, I guess, predetermined notions of what we're capable of or interested in. So that was a long way of kind of latching on to what you were saying there of giving kids like opportunity to explore, right?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely love that idea. It's something I try to encourage in my English class and also in my public speaking class as well, because I also teach public speaking, because public speaking in particular is a subject where many students, they walk into the class and they sit down and immediately they're just like, I hate this. I don't want to be here. And the thing I say on the first day to all the students is, the point of you being here is to explore these things for the first time. And you may not end up loving it, but you won't know unless you give it a try. And even when they are listening to other students' presentations, you know, there's this idea that in public speaking, it's just a class that's about presenting, but the class is also about being an effective and good and receptive audience member when your students are sharing things that they care about as well.
Right.
And so I try to have them keep an open mind for that, because a lot of times students will learn something new in public speaking class that has nothing to do with public speaking. It's just something that a classmate is interested in.
Right. And then also, like, you bring up a good point there. It's not only you as the teacher or as the person facilitating whatever it is that they're presenting or doing. You know, you have to be a good audience member. But I mean, I'm someone that took speech in high school too. And then I actually wound up minoring in like speech performance in college. So I did this all the time. And to me, one of the most valuable parts was, as a student in the class, having to be an audience member for 30 other people all the time. And it's not like the same thing as being an audience member for, you know, a show.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, like, if we could maybe talk a little bit about, I do want to talk about your mindfulness journey that you mentioned before when you were giving us a little bit about your background, but I do also want to kind of mix that together with how you notice the skills of mindfulness that you have found so valuable in your own life and bringing them into your classroom, how those skills, you kind of see a need for them in students today. And when we say mindfulness to everybody out there, I know we mention it back and forth on this show a lot and in a lot of other things that we publish, but I'm starting to realize that taking a second to just define what mindfulness is I think important, because we are using it as a core part of what we do and talk about and believe in. And I think that people have developed their own ideas of what it is. So just for our purposes, I think of mindfulness as really being in touch with awareness, with your present awareness, and doing things intentionally. So if you do something mindfully, people say that all the time now. People say they mindfully eat. It's really just being aware of what you're doing in that moment and only doing that thing.
Yeah, I have the exact same definition as you do.
Okay, cool.
As far as mindfulness is concerned. I mean, as we know, you can expand it into a more formal practice with things like meditation, but it doesn't have to be that. And as far as how I've seen it in my class, when I think about myself when I was in high school and I was in my class, I remember that when I got my first job in high school, I got my first cell phone, and it was a Nokia flip phone that basically had like T9 word texting, and I could play Snake on it.
Sounds beautiful.
I didn't even know I could. Yeah, no, it was at simpler times, and I didn't even know that I could text on it until I think I graduated high school. So I think about me sitting in my high school class and the amount of distractions that I had available to me, and then students today sitting in their high school classes and the amount of distractions that they have available to them through things like technology, it's tough for me to genuinely put myself in their shoes,
Right.
because, you know, things like social media and the internet, as I think about quite a bit, a lot of these experiences are tailored just to drain our attention and keep us scrolling.
Mm-hmm.
And it's almost like this idea that everything is super important, which makes nothing super important.
Yes. I love that you're saying that. Yep.
And I think about the social lives of my students in their classes, and constantly there are new updates and pictures and feeds being updated. And I'm sure that for many of them, there's this fear of sort of being left out and left behind if they're not always giving some attention to that. And I just try to keep that in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps build a little bit of empathy for the fact that a lot of times students are drawn to their phones and their devices.
Do you happen to know, in the students that you personally interact with every day in your room, do you know of any that do not have a personal device?
Yes, there's a handful.
Okay.
There are a couple who don't, but most of them do.
That's something I was reading about the last couple of days, as well as this growing movement towards parents and whole families that are holding out on devices for longer and longer. And so, a couple of things that you just said reminded me of there was an article I was reading this morning that was really great about like highlighting students that are like the only 7th grader in their school without a phone. And some things you just said reminded me of things that the kids were saying, of like, this one kid said there was a few other kids that didn't have phones. And then once he reached 8th grade, then the last kid besides him got one. He said, every time someone else gets a phone, he goes, my whole heart sinks, because suddenly they won't be looking at me anymore. They'll be looking down or something like that. And he thinks of it as actually losing a friend. And that was coming from like a 7th, 8th grader. Like,
wow.
Every time another kid gets a device, like he feels like that person is now gone from real life. And being the kid that doesn't have one, he is in the present moment, which is the whole purpose of this movement, by the way, is how can we keep our kids, not only keep their attention, away from where it shouldn't be, or give them more choice in how to spend their attention rather than feeling like they don't have a choice. But the other part of it is keeping them in the real world and grounded in what is actually around them, rather than being sunk into something that doesn't really feel like reality, but it becomes a reality that's not healthy. I don't have a question there. I'm just bringing that up.
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking about it, because that's pretty distressing.
It is. I tweeted that article this morning, and it actually has to do with the issue of the newsletter that we just published today about what it means to be a parent in this generation. But back to kind of thinking about the way parents might be making the decisions and putting that, thinking back to what you're telling us about your classroom, we obviously know personal devices are a barrier for everybody in their attention, but especially if you think of like the span of your career so far. And I think it's helpful that you've been in the same place too. Like, how have you seen over time, like, barriers to student attention and present-mindedness? How does that kind of show up or manifest itself, even if kids are not physically holding the device in your classroom, like while you're teaching or while you guys are working? Are there certain ways that you see that lack of self-regulation and lack of attention show up in school?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of different things. Students really do need some direction and some specificity on what the goals and objectives are in the classroom. And I've done lessons before where I keep it very open-ended intentionally, sort of with this idealist mindset where, I'm going to just present students with a bunch of things that are interesting and they'll sort of find their way to the learning. And sometimes that is just, it's not conducive for a good learning experience, and it allows a lot of those distractions and it allows just focus to be taken away and placed in other places. It's sort of like you want to build a scaffold where at first maybe you stay more directed, and then once the content is there, once the foundation is there, you can expand a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing where I've adjusted my teaching a little bit, where I have it a bit more structured in that sense. So when you're asking about barriers to attention,
Mm-hmm.
in your mind, when you think of that, are you thinking a barrier that's present in the students' minds already, or a barrier in the environment of the classroom? Or
Maybe I was asking two things at once there. Now that I was listening to you answer. Yeah, I think it's probably both, because maybe a better question is not to ask the barriers, but asking really how we know what some of the barriers are physically. But what you just said, they are mentally there. We all feel the mental pull of or effect of these things. But really, the question I want to know is how it manifests itself. Like, where do you see differences in attention? How long do you see them spending on one thing before they are bored? Like, how do you approach boredom? Like, how do you approach kids not being interested in something but needing to do it anyway? All of that kind of stuff.
Sure. Yeah. One of the structures that I use in my class is I use timers up on my board quite a bit. And I've sort of latched on to the idea of focusing on one thing for 20 minutes for my students. So in class, when we have a certain task or something to work on, typically what I'll do is I will tell them beforehand, we're going to work on this one thing, and I want you to work on it for just 20 minutes. And I almost echo a little bit some of the things that I hear quite a bit during mindfulness meditations. Like, if you feel your mind start to wander, just, remind yourself to come back to it. And typically that actually works out pretty well. Inevitably, there are students who sort of will drift to other things, or they'll be tempted to take out their phone. And as far as the consistency of things like that, there are some students who are sort of more susceptible to doing that. But then sometimes I have students who are usually very on point, very focused, who end up either daydreaming or they'll look at their phone. And that's one of the challenges, is because there are those personal things that are going on that maybe we don't know about. And it's hard to predict all of that. But again, having that structure where 20 minutes, if you do get distracted, it's okay. Just try to bring yourself back. It sort of creates a space where it's developing this practice of attention and staying focused. So I do notice that a lot of the students can sit and stay focused on that one thing for 20 minutes. And many of them really don't mind, and they recognize that they do get distracted, that they're able to sort of bring themselves back. And I have seen that having some consistency with that throughout the year has made it a little bit easier for some of them to stay on track for that amount of time.
I would love to hear your thoughts about actually making, attention practice or however you want to think of it, as something that's actually regularly built into what your students do. Like, how can we make this something that is, not just for those 20 minutes, but like you said, kids are constantly practicing bringing themselves back to the moment, which is an element of some of the other mindful activities that we know, like meditation being one of them. But we need to be able to take it out of those practices, which are often seen as like leisure activities, and bring all of them into the parts of our day where we need that help and that ability to self-regulate. And I liked the way you described that, like you are seeing that they're able to come back and just giving them that 20 minutes. And, we need that ability when we are working or completing a task or getting something done, or just being present with people, being present with all of these things. We need to be able to do that, letting go of what just happened and letting go of what might happen next, and only being here in this moment even if it's not something that you particularly want to do, like if it's school.
Right. Yeah. And one thing that I heard a while ago that I found really, really helpful for me in my own work that I am doing, whether it's grading essays or working on a creative project or having to get up early and go do yard work, is the idea that motivation is a great way to get people to get up and do stuff. But at a point, motivation inevitably is going to run out. And then you need to have that discipline to do it. And I mentioned that to my students as well, where if you just rely on being motivated all the time, it'll only bring you so far.
Right.
Unless it's something that you're extremely, extremely passionate about. And that's great. But inevitably, there will be things that you need to just sort of buckle down and do. And again, I tell myself this as well, is it's not bad or wrong to lose motivation or to lose your focus. It's going to happen. It's a thing. And it's not about beating yourself up if it happens and not allowing yourself to ever become unmotivated or unfocused. It's just recognizing, okay, maybe I need to just push myself a little bit further. And as far as bringing it to, and you mentioned earlier, you had this session about bringing some of these ideas into the summer, right, for students. And I think about ways that my students can do this outside of the classroom. And I encourage them, you have a timer on your phone. There are apps available that have timers as well. And it's almost like, try to challenge yourself a little bit. Just sit down and be like, okay, I'm going to take 10 minutes and do this one thing. And then just sort of afterwards, and something else that I do in my class is we reflect quite a bit, and doing reflection, seeing how you're feeling during one of these sessions and going back and seeing your progress can be really powerful as well. So just encouraging students to do some of these things outside of the classroom is helpful. And, at a point as a teacher, you give students these skills, and then in my mind, if one or two students end up getting something useful from it, that's a win in my book. So I'm going to keep trying to do it.
Yeah. Do you do anything like, do you do anything currently now where you actually have students tracking progress, or is that like of how they're, how they might be managing their attention, or like just as far as what you can see in school, or is that something that you're working towards as a next step?
So we do general sort of reflections on how you're feeling, how you're doing with this assignment. And sometimes students will mention how they're doing with paying attention. I don't explicitly ask, how long can you pay attention for?
Right. Okay.
But it sort of organically does come up in some of these reflections. Students will mention things like, oh, I'm having trouble focusing today because of X, Y, and Z, or I feel like I understand this material a bit better, so I'm able to focus more. Or also in my public speaking classes, we'll have full classes where we're in our school's media center for the block, because it allows students to spread out a little bit. They can sit at tables, and I have them set a goal in the beginning of the block. If they didn't reach the goal, I prompt them to write about what happened? Why didn't you meet the goal?
Right.
And sometimes, again, a lot of the thing is they'll mention the idea of being able to focus or not being able to focus. So I'm not doing it formally, but it does sort of come out in different ways.
Yeah. To me, it would be interesting if like the next step there were, and they could know this ahead of time, right? That because not being able to focus is such a common response for a lot of people when they're not able to complete something, no matter what it is. And so if they know that's even like part of that reflection routine, is like, if I say not being able to focus as the reason why I didn't get something done or reach a goal, I'm going to have to explain why. I'm going to have to like tell myself, or I'm going to have to write down as part of a reflection, what was I focused on instead? Or what was I thinking about? Or was I doing something else? And why was it? Like that meta awareness is essential, like to really getting to that next step, I think. And that would be really interesting to see if they know that question's coming. and they know how often focus is a problem. Like, okay, if focus is why I didn't get here, then why?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I do wonder if it wasn't posed in a way where beforehand I said something like, in your reflection, if you couldn't focus, you'll have to explain why. I wonder if I didn't say that beforehand, if I got to the end and they wrote they weren't able to focus, and then I asked them, well, why, if they would even know.
Right.
Because a lot of times, and I mean, we've all experienced it where, oh, I was supposed to do this thing and I didn't, but I don't even know what I was doing instead during that time.
Right. And maybe it's not even a question of why. Maybe that's just too much. Like, I don't know why sometimes, like you're saying now, but maybe it's a question of just the going back to the simple basics of mindfulness. And even in any way that people practice mindfulness, of it doesn't matter where your mind went, just acknowledge that it went away from the present.
Yeah.
And that's really it. Like, it doesn't even if you had kids answer why and they were like, oh, I was thinking about a fight I just had with my friend in the hall or whatever. And it doesn't even matter. Like, they could cross that out, like, and replace it with anything. Your mind went somewhere, but the job is to bring it back. And those other things are okay that they're in your head. And as the idea is, can I notice that I wasn't doing what I want to do? Like, what do you want? What do you want to do in this moment? It's not sit here and think of things. It's do the thing that you have a goal set for.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the challenges of addressing the idea of mindfulness in a setting like school, because one of the things that's always been most helpful for me as far as mindfulness and meditation is sort of approaching it where you can't have this very specific goal in mind. You want to it's an experience. You just do it, and then you just see how you feel afterwards. And when it feels like a chore, that's when sometimes there's this barrier where, oh, I feel I'm doing this thing because I feel obligated to do it. Or even in school, students might start to feel like, oh, I'm being forced to do this. And then is there some limit where the benefit sort of disappears, because it's walking this fine line between having it be this formal thing so that students get into the habit of doing it, but then having it be informal enough where it seems sort of natural and relaxed as well. So,
and I'm hoping that the way we're kind of just discussing this, it's not like, Tim's not giving us a report on all of these things that he definitely does, that he definitely thinks work and we should all do in our classrooms. We're discussing it. We're discussing it openly as like, here's what he's done personally. Here's what he talks to his kids about and they try, and maybe he'll work towards, implementing further a little bit more formal. Like, who knows, he'll change the way he does it to make adjustments based on what his students need. But I'm hoping this kind of conversation influences people to talk to us about it. Like, when when I know a lot of our listeners are people that follow us on Twitter, and literally tweeting and getting out the conversation about how you see this stuff in your room. What do you think about some of the things ideas that we're throwing out there of how this can be a more integrated part of our lives and of our students' lives? Like, we want to know what people are doing and what they're not doing and how we could make this better, because I think that it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all the things I'm saying, of course, it's all just anecdotal things I've seen in my classes. And I think that, there's a much larger conversation about this in different schools, different size schools, different grade levels as well. So yeah, it's an important conversation.
And I think another thing that's reminding me of a conversation I had last week as well, is this idea that part of all of this, and it's all valuable, it has nothing to do with just being valuable in a classroom. Like, it's all the reason why we talk about it so often like this is because it's valuable everywhere. And so even getting, and it can be done in little ways, like even getting kids to be in touch with their senses, like, and what's around them in a moment can help them be grounded in what they're doing in that moment. And I do think it's what I wanted to also comment on, something you just brought up before about students feeling like they don't want to pay attention because they are in school or doing something that they wouldn't do on their own, or that they have to hand it in, so they have to do it. And I do think that there is increasingly more and more value in all of us kind of having to do things. We all always are going to have to do things that we don't choose to do. And I think there is a value in still, even if it's only for tiny bits of time, but still kind of having to manage our attention on something that we didn't necessarily choose to do, because it builds a discipline. And you never know, like you were saying earlier, you never know what it is that you might find out you actually do love or do have some interest in, because you had to focus on it for a little bit of time and like a light bulb went off.
Yeah, totally. I 100% agree with that. And again, it's that idea of just encouraging to have an open mind, and also the idea that if you don't like something in the first 5 seconds, don't just abandon it. You give it a little bit of time as well, because sometimes that first impression is one thing, and then over time, once it starts to resonate, then maybe that interest gets developed. And I mean, I think about things that I'm interested in, and a lot of them I was not interested in at first, but then over time, as I learned more, I developed a passion for it. It's not all just sort of like a lightning bolt all the time.
Yeah, and it has to be like that too. Otherwise, I think a lot of us would try to have careers in the same things, because we all tend to be as different as we all like to think we are. I think a lot of people, especially when we're younger, are interested in a lot of the same stuff. That's why a lot of after school activities are there are certain ones that are more popular than others. Like, I mean, we all tend to kind of gravitate towards certain things that we think we're interested in, mostly because they already are entertaining to us. And I think that is a really big thing that we're going to have to grapple with now going into the next, the age of AI and things always being readily available to capture our attention, because they are endlessly entertaining.
Sometimes the best part of a new topic or a new experience is going through that process of figuring it out, that sort of struggle. And you just mentioned AI, and that's one thing that I think about a lot with artificial intelligence is students can use it for a bunch of different reasons, but I hope that it doesn't get rid of some of that, that productive struggle that happens in life and also in school. Because, in my public speaking class, I've developed a couple of things for students to use to help them brainstorm. And even then, I've sort of struggled internally. Is this taking away a process that students would eventually find rewarding?
Right.
Coming up with a topic and coming up with sections. I don't want to take away that whole part of the process, because there's like true reward in doing that. So over time, it's going to be interesting to see how these tools evolve and then what value is still placed on that.
And it makes me think in the future of like even the not so distant future, even like the next 5 years or so of the students, of the age of students you're teaching, like what does that satisfaction feel like? How does it change what it is, or does it change, what it is that makes us feel like, oh, we did something worthwhile? Like, what does doing really good individual work mean now?
Yeah.
Like, how does that change? What parts aren't going to change? Like, this is the stuff that I think about constantly. Like, what parts are we going to have to figure out how to get back? Because we still do need them to feel like we have ownership over something and we've done something well.
And I think about some of the things that I'm most proud of. And like I mentioned before, how I've done some coding projects and I've made websites and things like that. And now there are a lot of tools that can sort of automate a lot of the things that took me, a month to do. And I felt so accomplished, and I felt so much pride when I completed those projects. And if I did the same project now, that thing that took me a long time would take me like 2 hours. So now I wonder, would I have the same amount of a feeling of accomplishment, or would I, like you said, would I get it from somewhere else? So it's
and I think an important part of this when we're applying it to how we work with kids, and this can be even in the home setting as well, like as a parent, if you're a parent and listening and you don't work in a classroom or in a school at all, I think we have to all think of these things in a similar way of like, how do we, even as adults, but more specifically, how do our kids associate or maybe differentiate pleasure from something with accomplishment, which also can lead to pleasure. But I think that idea that if I'm going to sit down and spend time on something, I have to love it, doesn't necessarily always lead to accomplishment or feeling like you've done something really difficult or challenging. Often those really, really, really great experiences that are worthwhile are the things that are things that you wouldn't have thought you could do, or you didn't necessarily jump into wholeheartedly with like passionate, like abundant passion. And I know we're going in circles a little bit about talking about this interest stuff, but I think something you said before about accomplishment made me think of that. Like, do our kids really, are they able to differentiate between that feeling of just being entertained by what's in front of them and feeling like they did something really worthwhile? It's hard.
Yeah, it is hard. And in my experience, though, just by gauging on the reactions that my students have after an assignment, for example, the students who seem like they genuinely feel accomplished are the ones who initially showed disinterest or seemed like they were struggling a bit. So that still is there. And I think they may not be realizing it, but I definitely can see it when there's that sense of accomplishment, because pleasure nowadays, as I mentioned, with things like social media and smartphones, it's very, very easy to be entertained, but getting that sense of accomplishment, jumping over a hurdle, doing something that seemed very unlikely, and then getting to the finish line, that's something that can't just be sort of automated.
Yeah, I like how you just used, instead of saying not just something that's impossible, but something that seemed unlikely. I like that phrasing. I'm going to use it with you elsewhere, because that can apply to not just something that you think might be difficult, but also if you think it's unlikely that you will be able to complete something or tackle something because you don't like it. It can apply to a lot of different situations. I like that phrasing a lot. If it feels unlikely and then it happens, that's when.
Well, it's yours now, Sarah.
Thank you. It belongs to the Optimalist. Well, Tim, I think we've wandered in and out of a lot of topics and subtopics here, but now I feel like in the last 20 minutes or so, we've really started to unearth some gems that I'm excited for people to hear and talk about, hopefully talk about with us.
I mean, it's, one thing that I'm so happy about for being on the podcast and chatting with you is because it gives me a chance to sort of take these things that have been swirling in my head and sort of line them up and sort them out a bit. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I love when people think of, you're not the first person who said something like that. And that's one of the reasons why I love podcasting in general as well, is it does, no matter what it is that we're talking about, there's nothing like being, even though we're not really face to face, but we're voice to voice, to voice with another actual human being, and just having a conversation about something that we think is not only valuable to us and students and other adults, but everybody listening can also engage with it as well. And I think that it's so valuable. And this is why I'm saying we could meander into these subtopics forever, because that's another thing that I think about a lot when it comes to teaching in the age of AI. How do we get kids to interact with what's in front of them, and not what becomes endlessly available virtually? Because those human voices and relationships from real people are invaluable.
Yeah, totally.
I think that's a good way to start wrapping up this conversation. What about you?
Sounds good to me.
So the way we've been ending all these episodes is really by honing in for just a couple of seconds more on, or minutes more, not seconds really, on what it is that makes you, what makes Tim Tim, and what kind of connects you to everything that you put into your work and the way you interact with your students and so on. So with that being said, you can answer as many of these as possible, or you can say no, but can you give us something maybe that you're reading right now or watching or listening to, which could be a podcast or music or both, anything that's like being consumed by you it could possibly be influencing the way you think?
Sure. I'm going to answer all of
Awesome.
those. So as far as what I'm reading, I'm still chugging away on this book that I have called The Secret Life of Programs by Jonathan Steinhardt, which is a book about how computers work sort of at the base level. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, I've done coding projects and things like that, but that's all very sort of high level computer stuff. And this is very low level. So it explains just things like binary and how the hardware of a computer works. And I figure if I'm going to be using this technology, I owe it to myself to learn how it actually works foundationally. Mm-hmm. So I've been reading that. And then also it's upstairs, so I don't have the details. But before bed, I've been reading from this book of Italian folk tales that my sister-in-law bought for me. And it's been awesome. It's a lot of unique different stories, and a lot of them are sort of, you can see variations of ones that are sort of more well known to me, like from Hans Christian Andersen and stuff.
I almost said I have so much of that. I don't have so much of it, but I do have a few folktale collections that I have gone through lots of phases of being drawn to. Now you're making me want to do the same thing. That's a great pre-bedtime reading. That's a great time.
Yeah, they're pretty short. You can just pick one up. You can read it, and then
hopefully they make their way into your subconscious when you sleep.
Yes, and then you make good moral decisions the next day.
Cool. And also it should be notable to everybody that Tim still feels the draw to study how computers work, even though humans won't be creating technology pretty soon because AI will do it for us. But that's the thing. We need to still be interested in how do we make kids still interested in things that they won't have to even do?
That's right. Yeah. And, I feel like as things advance, I think a lot of people are skipping over some of the lower level stuff. Even with things like AI, people are learning, how to use Chat GPT, but they don't know how AI actually works. So I'm trying to do my part to learn some of the basics.
Yeah, I love that. In yoga, they call that the beginner's mind, right? Even when you're an advanced, it's so great. Even if you're like the expert professor, it's the best to go back to being the beginner and think about it from that way. Okay, keep going. What are you watching?
The thing I've been watching, this is a little bit strange. So this past week on Twitch, there was an event called GDQ. GDQ is Games Done Quick, and it is a 24-hour week-long video game speed running marathon. So it's a fundraiser where they raise money for Doctors Without Borders. They actually just passed $1 million yesterday, which is awesome.
Cool.
But it's just people from all over the world. They play video games and they just try to beat them as fast as possible. And so they can use bugs in the game. They can do weird, crazy stuff. And with it being on 24/7, it's been really good just in the background. I'll be walking through my living room and I'll be like, oh, someone's beating Pokemon in an hour or whatever. And so I think that this week I've been pretty busy. And so I haven't really had the time to sit down and give, 100% to watching something. So that's sort of just been running in the background. So a little bit of a bizarre selection, but that's what's been on my TV this week.
So you don't participate, you're watching. That's what you're saying?
No. I mean, these people, they spend all year just practicing. Wow. And the amount of work that goes into this is absolutely mind blowing. It will be like a 2-hour game and they need to memorize like every single step that they take in order to optimize the amount of time it takes.
It really is the speed. The speed is the most important part.
Yeah. And they try to get world records and things like that. It's pretty wild.
Interesting. I don't think we've had anyone bring up something like that, like something like internet based, like Twitch in general, as far as what they're watching. But that's cool.
And then so for music, this is another sort of bizarre answer as well. So I have a record collection. I've been collecting records since I was in high school, and I picked up 2 records recently and I listened to both of them. One of them is the album Lifted by Bright Eyes.
Yay.
From the early 2000s, which is one of my favorite records. I got into them in high school, and I actually went to a music festival last weekend and they were selling records and I bought it there. So I listened to that.
Cool. But specifically on vinyl, which is great.
Yes. Yeah. Which is good. And it's, listening to a record is a good sort of mindful activity in my mind. Like you have to sit and listen
definitely.
And you have to flip the record over.
I agree.
And then probably on the opposite end of the spectrum, the other record that I bought was from a British death metal band called Bolt Thrower. This album Mercenary that came out in the late 90s. So that's very different from Bright Eyes. But I also like to listen to some aggressive music as well. And people are sort of surprised when they find that out because I tend to be pretty calm. But I like it.
You're very mindful about what you choose to listen to, Tim.
Yes, that's right.
And as we end all things here, as we end the podcast, I don't know what other things I'm talking about. Can you maybe, I know we've talked about focus throughout this entire episode so I'm risking sounding redundant here, but I'm going to do it anyway. Can you maybe leave everybody with one way that you, or method of focusing or having better attention that you find actually works? And this doesn't have to have anything to do with your kids, but works for you.
Sure. So one thing that I do is, whether it's a reminder on my phone or even having an object to remind me, or using a different app, or like Focusable works really well for this as well. Just reminding yourself to be present throughout your day, and just taking that time to just look at your surroundings, think about your environment, take in what's around you, and also to be gentle with yourself when you do that, and to not be judgmental if you are having trouble focusing as well. I think those two things really go hand in hand, because and in the past, I've done this where I'm in a situation where I am really, really having trouble being present, and I end up trying to be present, but then I just end up getting frustrated and it makes everything worse. And just giving yourself that gentle reminder, it can really make a big difference, especially if it's done consistently, and making it into a practice. And then it can just, for me, it's helped me be present a lot throughout the day.
Awesome. Well, I think this might actually have been so far our most focused episode on focus.
There we
which
go.
is great. It's usually woven in there somewhere, but I think that this wound up being really helpful for me. And I think, as you said before, to think for yourself, to think out loud about how some of these things apply to a variety of environments in our lives, and how they're evolving as we step into a new technological age.
Yeah, and I hope that anybody who listens, you get something from this. Maybe one of our thoughts resonated with you. And because I feel like a lot of these feelings, a lot of them are universal, and hopefully just, knowing that we're all on this journey together can be a helpful thought to think about.
Definitely. Well, thanks a lot, Tim. It was so great for you to take time out today to have this conversation with me. I know we talk a lot, but this is a different type of talking, when you have to really be present for what it is that we're discussing. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Sarah. This was awesome.
Thanks, everyone, for listening this week. And thanks so much to Tim for sharing his mindfulness journey and being open about how he thinks ignoring the attention crisis will impact us and our students. As always, your feedback is the best way to help the podcast grow in its purpose and help us keep getting better. You can leave a comment on Substack, a review in Apple Podcasts, and you can reach me on Twitter at scandela9. You can listen and subscribe to the Optimalist podcast wherever you love listening to great podcasts. New episodes are released every Wednesday. Links to all of these resources are available in the show notes. And the Optimalist podcast is brought to you by Focusable, the only app that gives you the pulse you need for better attention. And it's free. Create an account today at getfocusable.com or by downloading Focusable on any iOS or Android device. You can also follow us at GetFocusable on Twitter and Instagram. Thanks for listening to The Optimalist. I'll see you next week. Stay focused.